Greetings from Michigan State University and welcome to EAB University's Fall 2019 webinar series, which is funded by the USDA Forest Service. This is Robin Usborne, and along with my EAB University colleagues, Cliff Sadoff and Elizabeth Barnes from Purdue University, and Amy Stone from The Ohio State University, we welcome you to today's webinar entitled The Unusual Case of Minnesota and the Emerald Ash Borer. It's presented today by Val Cervenka, Minnesota DNR Forest Health Program Consultant, Brian Palick, Science Leader for Applied Forest Ecology, USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station, and Paul Dubuque, Minnesota DNR Silviculture Program Consultant. We welcome your questions and comments today. Please type them in the Q&A feature or the chat pod, and we will be responding to them after the webinar presentation. Tomorrow, you will receive an email that has a link to a short, voluntary, confidential survey that we hope you will take the time to fill out. It helps us bring these free educational webinars to you. The email will also include contact information of our presenters, as well as information on how to obtain CEUs for viewing the live webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing later on the EAB University page of the www.emeraldashborer.info website. Thank you for attending, everyone. And Val, you can unmute your mic and begin your presentation.
Thanks, Robin. As Robin said, I'm Val Cervenka. Good morning. Thanks for joining us. And I coordinate the Forest Health Program here at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, or DNR, in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we wanted to share our unique story of emerald ash borer in Minnesota with you today. So I will present the background on emerald ash borer here. It's different in Minnesota, and that's just the classic Minnesota response to anything out of the ordinary. So, like, you say the cow jumped over the moon? That's different. Just a little Minnesota speak lesson here. And then Brian will follow up with ecosystem consequences from loss of black ash to emerald ash borer and potential adaptation strategies. And then Paul will wind up the morning with adaptive management strategies. So let's look at some ash statistics here, and we can look at our population of ash in a number of different ways, basically all saying the same thing. So we have a lot of ash in Minnesota. We have more ash than any other state in the U.S. And we are home to more than 1 billion ash trees and more than 1 million acres of black ash dominated cover type. The Minnesota DNR Division of Forestry manages about 120,000 acres of ash, and ash makes up about 7% of Minnesota's forests and more than 30% of our community trees. And if you happen to hear Nate Siegert's EAB update a couple of weeks ago, you know that black ash is EAB's most preferred host of the ash species he looked at. Who knew that one day we'd be known not just for Paul Bunyan and 10,000 lakes, we'd be also known as the ash capital of the U.S. So now for our emerald ash borer stats. It was discovered here in St. Paul in 2009. And we found this infestation very early on. It was only about 4 years old. And of course, like all EAB infestations, it began to spread out of the infestation. And I'm going to take you through a series of slides here to kind of show you just where emerald ash borer has spread since 2009. So here you see it where it landed in St. Paul. The very next year, it was down in our southeasternmost county, Houston County, I believe it was in 2008 that emerald ash borer was discovered right across the Mississippi River in Wisconsin, in Victory. And that's actually where we thought we were going to find it first. And you can just start to see here how it's spreading within the infestations where it was first located, popping out a little bit there. And then in 2015, we found it here in the Northeast, right at the tip of Lake Superior here in Duluth, Minnesota. And we also knew that there was an infestation in Superior, Wisconsin, just across the lake, I believe the year before that. And so we continue to have finds around our infestations. But then in 2018, it popped out into a couple of brand new counties, obviously not natural spread, but spread through firewood. And then this past year, we really saw some jumps. Some of those jumps follow a freeway corridor here, but very likely spread by firewood. So that's where we are 10 years later. 20 counties and part of another are quarantined. Only part of our largest county was quarantined. So that's the 21st county. And as far as we know, EAB hasn't invaded the vast black ash swamps we have in northern Minnesota. And it appears that the rate of spread is slower here. But why? Well, here's some possible reasons for the relatively slow spread here. We found the initial infestation early, so we could respond very quickly. And the city of St. Paul, in which the insect was first found, they were very aggressive in removing ash in that initial infestation location. And then Minneapolis quickly joined to begin removing trees as they became infested. Both cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul already had management plans in place, so they knew what they were going to do once we became infested. The Minnesota Department of Agriculture, who is our regulating agency for the state, quickly quarantined counties as EAB was discovered. Minnesota already had an existing law prohibiting firewood being brought into state parks, so people had started to hear about why they should not move firewood. Emerald ash borer goes into its 2-year life cycle if it hasn't reached the required degree days in a year to develop to the point at which it normally overwinters as a pre-pupa. And most importantly, at least for now, it gets really cold here. And I'm not just bragging. You'll see in a minute how cold it can get. In the winter of 2009-2010, cold hardiness studies were conducted by Rob Vanette of USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station and also the director of the Minnesota Invasive Terrestrial Plants and Pest Center, and Mark Abrahamson, who is the director of the Plant Protection Division at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And in a nutshell, they found that nearly 80% of EAB larvae die when it's minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and almost 100% will die when it's below 30 degrees Fahrenheit. It's good to keep in mind that mortality varies within trees and from site to site in microclimates there. Even the supercooling temperature, which is the point at which a larva will freeze, varies from year to year. And if cold temperatures don't immediately kill a larva, they can still die from just long exposure to cold. Well, no problem here in Minnesota. In 2014, during the cold snap that's commonly known as the polar vortex, the temperature in the Twin Cities metro area reached minus 23 degrees Fahrenheit in January, and the sampling that was taken then showed that 60 to 70% of larvae were killed. And then this past winter, we had extreme cold revisited, and in late January, temperatures around the state were brutally cold. Survey results of the impacts of cold temperatures in areas where EAB has been found look like this. Up to 99% larval mortality was found in central Minnesota, where a recent population had been discovered. The air temperature was below -30. Up to 89% mortality was found in northeastern Minnesota and the Duluth area, and up to 86% mortality was found here in the Twin Cities metro area, where the air temps were less than -20 degrees Fahrenheit. And by the way, that digital thermometer shows an actual temperature reading from just about 40 miles northwest of Duluth. So with cold like that, emerald ash borer populations are definitely reduced, but they're not eradicated. So I want to talk about, just show you the cold hardiness zone, the plant hardiness zone map here, and just we're going to focus in on Minnesota today, and I've kind of outlined what zones occur in Minnesota. So let's take a closer look here. And looking at areas that are generally infested with EAB here, they're consistent with the USDA plant hardiness zone. So you can see that EAB is generally found in the 4B area, and this is also 4B up here in Duluth, where there's a buffering effect from Lake Superior. So you could use the hardiness zones to determine your strategy for preparedness for EAB. So for example, if in the zones 4B with an annual low from -20 to -25 degrees Fahrenheit, emerald ash borer mortality will likely vary each winter. It's not going to be the same, but you can conduct your tree inventories and develop management plans. You can do visual surveys to determine whether or not trees are infested. You can practice integrated pest management whenever possible to protect or remove trees and remove poor quality ash and remove or treat infested ash. And then when it's, when you're looking at the northern part of the state in zones 3A, 3B, and 4A with an annual below of less than -25, winter mortality could be high in most years. You can continue tree inventories and general emerald ash borer surveys. If you find that trees are infested, you could take branch samples to assess extent of infestation and condition of the larvae there, determine whether they're living or dead. And in those zones, regular surveys and rapid removal of infested trees might be enough to prevent outbreaks. And the takeaways today for management, just keep in mind that the cold is not going to kill all emerald ash borer, but it'll slow us down and give us time for management plan updates and improvements. And the effects of cold can be incorporated into those management plans. Of course, climate change will likely affect the hardiness zone movement and emerald ash borer survival, but how and when that is going to take effect is still uncertain. I would like to acknowledge a few people, Rob Vanette for all his assistance and information for this part of the presentation, and the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources Forest Health team for their input, Robin Osborne for inviting us and giving us this opportunity. And next up, take it away, Brian Pollock.
Okay, I should be unmuted and my screen should have launched. So, as was indicated, I'm Brian Pollock. I'm with the USDA Forest Service in Northern Research Station in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. And what I'm going to talk about is work we've been pursuing on transitioning black ash wetlands to this potential EAB infested future that Val has talked about. And I just want to acknowledge that this work is involves a number of people, but in particular Rob Slezak with the Minnesota Forest Resource Council and Tony D'Amato, who's at the University of Vermont, are actively involved with this. So just kind of an outline. I'll talk a little bit about context, talk a little bit about the concern, and then the need relative to adaptive strategies that include replacement tree species. So just kind of going back to the importance of this resource in Minnesota that Val pointed to, why is Minnesota different? Well, it's different because, as you can see from this map, we have a tremendous abundance of the resource, particularly black ash in Minnesota, and especially in northern Minnesota. So that circled areas where we'll focus and where we focus. And in particular, what we're concerned about and working on is black ash that occurs in small to really large, expansive palustrin wetlands in that part of the state. So one of the things that makes Minnesota different, following on Val's theme here, from other places where the species or the genus occurs, is that black ash tends to dominate these northern forest wetlands in Minnesota. And you can see that here. This is showing density of tree species in the overstory from a really large sample of wetlands across northern Minnesota. And overwhelmingly, black ash is the dominant species. So why is that a concern? It's a concern because if projections hold true and EAB starts to spread west and kills black ash in the overstory, there's no tree species that are abundant enough in these wetlands generally that will readily replace black ash through, for example, gap replacement when the ash die. The news gets even a little worse than that, in that there isn't a lot of advanced regeneration of other tree species in these same forest settings. And this shows you density of sapling size species, again, from this wide range of sites that we've worked in. And this is broken out by two of the major palustrin wet forest settings. So one is very wet and one is wet. And what you can see here is that the sapling layer is mostly black ash, which we are all concerned about, and then alder. So really, again, not a lot of large regeneration in that sapling layer. I'm not showing these data here, but we've also looked at smaller regeneration, large regeneration, smaller than saplings, and it's largely shrub dominated across the north in these settings. So the take home is that there is no tree species that have a sufficient established regeneration other than black ash that could replace ash, given the potential for EAB mortality. And so one more piece of bad news, it gets even worse in that we start looking at the climate projections for northern Minnesota. In a nutshell, it's that figure on the left where by the end of the century, the projections are summers like Nebraska and winters like northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin. And with that comes a range of projected habitat changes for those co-occurring tree species. This comes out of tree atlas modeling, which probably many of you are familiar with. That suite of native tree species that occur in low abundance in these wetlands, half have reduced projections of reduced habitat suitability, and the other half are either neutral or increasing. But again, we go back to that figure on the bottom where even the species that look to be future adapted occur in really low abundance, so they're not readily there to be replacing black ash. So the concern then is that if EAB moves west and starts decimating these wetlands, without black ash, there's essentially no trees. And what happens? Wetlands get even wetter due to the loss of that transpirational pump. Sedge and shrub communities start to dominate. Tree establishment becomes particularly difficult because it's wetter and a variety of other changes. And then there's this concurrent loss of ecosystem function and habitat that goes along with that. So the need that we've been addressing is for adaptive strategies that keep forests on these landscape positions in some form or fashion. And that's what I want to talk about here. It's a large project that we've been working on for a number of years now, that it's evaluating the ecological impacts of emerald ash borer in black ash forests. It's a big scale manipulation on the Chippewa National Forest in north central Minnesota. You can see the shaded outline of that national forest. And the two broad questions we're working on are, what are the potential impacts of EAB and associated management actions on structure and function of these wetlands? And then, are there adaptive strategies to build site-level resilience to EAB? And the way we define that is, can we maintain forested wetland condition in some form or fashion? So this study was put on the ground in the harvesting part of it in 2011-12 in the winter, planted the following year. There's 4 treatments. We'll look at these in a different way in just a second, but an unharvested control. So this is as Val pointed out, this is an area where EAB has not gotten to yet. So these are healthy forests currently. Unharvested control, clear cutting, group selection, and then something we call EAB emulation. And all the treatments are pretty big in scale, and it's highly replicated. And you can see that we're examining a whole range of responses, ecosystem responses, with a large number of collaborators. But what I want to do is just focus on hydrology and then what happens to planted regeneration, planted trees. So here's an aerial view of the treatments. You're looking down on one of the study areas on the National Forest. And these are really large, extensive wetlands here, so not easily defined stands, as it were. So what you're looking at there is the control, which is basically just a 4-acre circle that we've delineated in this wetland. And then there's a clear cut, and this was down to the lowest level of utilization, probably 3 inches diameter trees. This is what we're calling the group selection treatment, which is about 20% of the area of that 4-acre patch in these 10th-acre group cuttings. And I'm not going to go into this in detail, but this is actually pretty reflective of the natural dynamic of this forest type, which are much like upland northern hardwoods, in that they're uneven age naturally and driven by patch gap disturbances. And then here is our emulation of EAB treatment, which is essentially girdling all ash above about 1 inch in those 4-acre patches. And that photo there on the left is right after girdling. These trees are all dead now, and we estimate we girdled something like 10,000 to 12,000 trees, and they took about 2 to 3 years to die, so somewhat similar to what EAB does. And then another component of this, within each of these treatments, we have planted this suite of replacement tree species. There's 12 species. We actually planted in both the fall and then the following spring for most of them, and most are present in this regional forest type, so they're part of the native component of trees in these wetlands. The ones in red here are what we call future adapted to either climate, based on tree atlas modeling, or EAB. And then so you see that suite there. And then there's a couple from the next southern climate zone in Minnesota, including hackberry and swamp white oak. So essentially, we're doing range expansion for those 2 species north. And then one exotic, Manchurian ash, which is native to Northeast Asia and Japan. It's EAB resistant, and there's some thought that it could be a potential substitute for black ash for Native American basket making. So we are evaluating that species. I'm going to jump into some results just real quickly here. The hydrologic response is really key to everything that's going on. And so that's what I'm getting at here, the water table response. The take home is that when you lose all these trees, the sites get wetter, not surprisingly. We published a few papers on this. This is the most recent one. And what you're looking at here is across a range of years, and this is on the x-axis, the uncut control forest water table depth, and that's compared to the treatment water table depth, so the 3 treatments, clear cut, girdle, group. And I guess the easiest way to think about this, I think you can see my pointer. If you look at 2012, when the control water table is 100 centimeters below the surface, the clear cut is about 50. So you can see, for the most part, the clear cut and girdle treatments are generally, for much of the year, much of the depths, above the control, which is actually, so above the control. And then, so that's one of the take-homes. Girdle and clear cut, shallower depth to water table at a variety of depths. And then the group selection actually tracks the control forest pretty well. So that's this green color, which is close to the 1-to-1 line in most years. For the girdle and clear cut, the take home is that because those sites are getting wetter, regeneration is a pretty challenging issue from seed or from planting, or even naturally. And another factor to that hydrologic response that plays into regeneration is that there's really dramatic changes in their herbaceous plant community that goes along with these treatments. That presents a pretty intense level of competition for tree regeneration. So in the clear cut and girdle treatments in particular, there's this increase in herbaceous cover, including sedges, grasses, cattails. And you can see on the left, that's the clear cut treatment, and on the lower right, that's the girdle treatment actually from this fall. So really quite the dramatic changes in those with that loss of transpiration from ash. So challenging environment for tree regeneration, and that's what I want to kind of show you some results from now. What this is showing is our planted seedling survival after 5 years. And these numbers will be pooled across all the treatments initially. So what you're looking at are the 12 species we planted. And there's the rank order of survival after 12 years. We have just finished up the 7th year planting survey this fall. What you can see is American elm at the top and yellow birch at the bottom. And kind of the take-home messages here is that the survival is highest for non-native Manchurian ash, pathologically limited American elm. This is disease-tolerant elm that we planted here. And then also these outer-range species, hackberry and swamp white oak from southern Minnesota. And those species with the high survival are actually predicted to have increased habitat suitability by the end of the century, according to Tree Atlas. And then the survival is lowest for this group of native species, native to that ecosystem. So they tend to be fairly low as a general rule. So that's across all treatments. Here we break survival out by treatment, and what you want to just kind of focus in on are the patterns here, the 4 treatments: clear cut, girdle, group, and control. And then it's the species on the y-axis, and you can see that trend. And it's generally those species we just looked at on the previous slide that have the highest survival in any of these treatments. But for the most part, survival was generally lowest in the clear cut. So everything is shifting to lower survival. And the survival patterns among species are pretty similar for the control, the group, and the girdle treatments. That was survival. We're also looking at growth of these seedlings, and this just shows some data for growth between 2013 and 2015, again arrayed by the 4 treatments. And this is relative diameter growth here. So you have to do this in a relative sense because of the different growth habits of the species and the different planting stock types. But you can see the general trend across those 4 treatments. And height actually paralleled this as well, so it's pretty similar for relative height growth. And kind of the take-homes here is that relative diameter growth increased from the control, lowest in the control for all the species, to the girdle down here, to the clear cut being the highest. And the group was kind of in between as well. And again, height growth was similar. And then kind of thinking about some of the individual species, balsam poplar, which is POBA on your graph, had the highest growth in any of the treatments. And swamp white oak and American elm were kind of moderate in all the treatments. And then Manchurian ash and hackberry were pretty low in all the treatments. And I point those out because most of those had pretty good survival. And that's what I want to go with next, is just kind of thinking about how we talk about potential replacement species. We try to do it in a way that helps people understand the need to balance survival and growth, also to consider a shorter and longer term perspective, and also to consider the best silvicultural approach to pursue this in. And for us, what I'll focus in on is this group selection approach. Again, you're looking at pictures from the group treatment. It's consistent with the ecology of this ecosystem, again, driven by gap dynamics. If you go back to the hydrology, it minimizes that water table increase, and it also limits that herbaceous plant increase that I pointed out. The regeneration survival of those planted seedlings are pretty good or better than the other treatments, and then growth is moderate, at least compared to the clear cut and girdle. So we put those two things together in the context of this group selection. So here you have the rank order from highest to lowest of 5th-year survival. There's the rank order of from highest to lowest of 3rd-year diameter growth. And then we kind of integrate the two like this. So looking at balsam poplar, which is a native component of this forest type, had okay medium survival, but really high growth. And people are now starting to look at it as sort of a short-term replacement for black ash in these wetlands should massive mortality occur. But remember, it's a southern boreal species, and the habitat projection for it with climate change is expected to dramatically decrease in northern Minnesota. So it might not be a long-term solution. And what we're talking about in terms of long-term, based on our results, is that swamp white oak is a potential. So really high 5th-year survival and pretty decent growth as well. So, and then again, it's a species with a projection of increased habitat suitability in northern Minnesota. It's not far from outlier individuals from our study area, although the main population is about 120 kilometers southeast. Okay, so just to summarize what I've talked about, adaptation strategies for black ash wetlands need to consider replacement tree species, as well as the silvicultural approach best suited to facilitate their success, loss of trees from EAB, or preemptive clear cutting, which has been pushed in some circles as a way to deal with this, to get rid of the ash before EAB gets here, might increase growth of some species if they survive, but it really shifts these sites towards challenging hydrologic conditions that limits long-term survival of non-sprout regeneration. And black ash is a sprouter, so it is resprouting. Group selection is consistent with the ecology of the systems and has generally good seedling survival, including several future adapted species. And then balsam poplar and swamp white oak may provide a good balance between growth and survival, particularly in that group selection treatment. And I'd also point out, if you notice this, that the potential for preemptive planting in uncut forest of more tolerant future adaptive species may be a viable option, because we actually have quite good survival of most species in the uncut forest. So with that, I'm done, and we'll turn this over to Paul to take over.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Paul Dubuque with Minnesota DNR Forestry and the Silviculture Program Consultant with the division, and I oversee reforestation activities across the state. I'm based out of St. Paul, Minnesota. So I'm going to continue to build on some of the work that Brian and Val have presented this far. We'll take a brief review of the ash native plant communities in Minnesota, the uniqueness about the two wet forest communities that Brian mentioned. We'll look at some of the ash resources and harvest levels. I'll touch on regeneration methods that are occurring in DNR, and look at a number of black ash issues and the challenge with management. I'll touch on adaptation in the context of strategies, and also talk about looking at revising our management goals. So the idea is just being able to live with EAB if and when it arrives. And finally, I'll look at opportunities for reforestation that we're doing on state land and some next steps. So as we look at the context of native plant communities with environmental gradients, the DNR maps classifies native plant communities across the state. So you can see on this graph to the left, moisture gradients on the vertical axis and nutrient gradient on the horizontal axis, from dry to wet and poor to rich. Typically, you're going to find ash in these three systems in Minnesota. They're found in mesic hardwoods and more patchy, kind of clumpy configurations, and then floodplain forests, primarily along major river systems in Minnesota. And then, of course, the wet forest is where we see the most dominant ash. And so when we understand about native plant communities, they're really a group of plants that interact with each other and their environment in ways that are not greatly altered by modern human activity. And so these groups form mappable units that tend to repeat over space and time. So when we map them, we consider the vegetation, the hydrology, landforms, soils, and particularly the natural disturbance regimes. And so with respect to ash, you can think about natural disturbance in terms of periodic flood and drought cycles, windstorms, insect and disease outbreaks, and then just mature tree mortality or senescence. In particular, if you look at the map here on the left, I'm showing examples of units of wet forest communities that rank in that sort of moderate to high moisture and nutrients. So they're very rich, floristically diverse communities in Minnesota. So in particular, the northern wet ash swamp, the WFN 55, this is typically found in near rivers and lakes or wetlands. This has a little more shallow peat over soil. You have standing water through most of the growing season, but it will drain in late summer. Ash is of course dominant, but you do see occasionally mixes of aspen and balsam poplar, balsam fir spruce, and a few hardwood species. We feel like this is the best opportunity for stand management, given that there are other non-ash species present and its proximity to mesic upland forests. In contrast, we have the very wet ash swamp. This is found usually in closed depressions or around edges of large peatlands in northern Minnesota, as you can see here on the map. Typically, standing water is present throughout the growing season, and drainage is usually very, very poor. And ash is very dominant here, representing oftentimes over 90% of the trees. You do see occasionally mixes of white cedar, spruce, and balsam fir. This is, of course, a concern in terms of stand management, given that persistent water table, the potential for management to result in swamping and conversion to non-forest. So when we look at ash ecology, habitat, growing stock, and forest products, kind of lumping this together in terms of all the resources, you know, as Brian alluded to, ash is very slow growing. It's a long-lived species. It's generally shade intolerant except during early development. And you can often find it in multi-age classes, 2 to 3 age classes present, oftentimes in natural or unmanaged stands, and the recruitment occurs during those drought periods and gap disturbance due to wind or tree senescence or insect and disease. This volume graph here has sort of the classic reverse J-shaped diameter distribution, which kind of suggests some multi-age forests at a landscape level. So it's important to be thinking about that age structure in terms, and the natural disturbance regime in terms of silviculture and reforestation. Just briefly, in terms of habitat, ash provides a variety of habitat for game species, mammals, woodpeckers, and songbirds. Some initial research done at the Natural Resources Research Institute in Duluth indicates that black ash provides unique habitats for bird communities and amphibians when you compare to upland forests. And they generally has higher bird species richness and diversity than upland forest. With ash utilization, you can think about in terms of grade lumber, pulp, pallet, and engineered wood products are the primary products harvested in Minnesota or processed in Minnesota. The DNR ash growing stock really is represented by smaller diameter classes in this 5 to 12 inch. So that has some implications in terms of processing ash in the state. And it's a good fit in some respect with pulp mills, but markets tend to be somewhat variable and somewhat weak. So that's certainly a concern for us as we move into increasing our management of ash. So there's a modest amount of high quality sawlog and veneer ash grown, particularly in southeast Minnesota, but primarily found on other ownerships. And additional markets include, of course, firewood, which is an important resource for landowners in Minnesota, and of course, non-timber products in terms of tribal basket making. So we look at all ownership harvest levels in Minnesota. figures dating from 1975 to 2016. We see that harvest has increased since 1997, but remains relatively flat since 2009. DNR has estimated long-term annual sustainable harvest level at 350,000 cords. So we're well within that range for sustainability. And you can see here just a gradual trend through time. Other data suggests that average annual growth far exceeds mortality, but of course that's in today's view. But as we know, with the location of EAB being present on the eastern fringe of the state and near Duluth, it's a possibility through hauling of fuel wood that we could see that move into the interior portions where ash is present in greater numbers. We look at state harvest levels on DNR lands. This is a graph that shows in green here. This is ash volume offered from 2010 through 2019. This is fiscal year data, and ash harvest volume in the black line. So typically we've been offering volumes around 10 to 12,000 cords up through about the 2015, 2016. When we look at long-term annual sustainable harvest levels, DNR estimates those between 25,000 and 40,000 cords. And beginning in 2017 and moving forward, we're accelerating the ash acres, visiting and offering volume targets in the next 10-year planning period. So in addition to the 10-year cord targets, we'll be also offering an additional 10,000 cords annually for the next 5 years. So you can see most recently we are offering very close to that target. Now we will look at state regeneration methods. In this case, this is where ash is a primary species from fiscal year 2012 to 2020, looking at division timber sale permits. Historical forest management and black ash generally consist of using clear cut with reserves, group or single tree selection, seed tree and shelter wood. Especially in recent years, we've seen increases here, and as well as non-regeneration harvesting, or better known as thinning, intermediate treatment, where your goal is more on the overstory crop trees. So in general, we see roughly around 55% in the clear cutting prescription, but we are seeing slight increases in these other methods, and I think a lot of that's attributed to some of the regional research work that's being done in Minnesota and in Wisconsin and Michigan. So we think about a regeneration method framework. This table is basically showing the different regeneration methods, approximate canopy removal and gap sizes, and potential basal area retentions, generally going from more open strategies through large to small gap strategies. So silviculture strategies are just essentially sequences of treatment outcomes designed to emulate the natural stand dynamics, promote natural regeneration, or prepare stands for artificial regeneration. Most of these are going to involve 1 or 2 stand entries over a short period of time that will move a stand towards the desired future stand condition. And that really, so depending on stand conditions and current regeneration on stand in sites, there's really 3 strategies that we envision. First is a reinitiation that would emulate severe windthrow to create open to very large gap habitat, so that sort of emulates this clear cutting with reserves approach or seed tree approaches. A second strategy would be to maintain a stand as with selective windthrow by removing the initial cohort trees in large gaps, which might emulate sort of a shelter wood approach. And then finally, the third strategy is maintain a stand as with natural tree mortality disease or selective windthrow to create small gap habitat, which we align with a group or tree selection approach. And as you can see, the canopy gaps are considerably smaller than what you would see in clear cut. So just looking at the examples of these, so obviously this is a scenario that we want to avoid when we think about clear cut with clear gaps with no retention of trees, whether they're ash or non-ash. So, you know, our recommendation is avoid this unless you're working in mixed stands with healthy non-ash seed trees. So it'll most likely cause a tree mortality and replacement was that hydrologic fluctuation, that water table bounce that happens, and also potentially some other causes like beaver activity. So historically, I think rarely do we see ponding result in any stand initiation of trees. So in a clear cut or open to large gap strategy, there's still a concern, as Brian had pointed out, about hydrology not recovering to pre-harvest condition. While you do have regeneration occurring, as seen here with ash sprouts and elm, both of those are highly vulnerable to EAB and, of course, Dutch elm disease impacts on the elm sprouts. And you also have this risk of conversion to non-forested community. So more typically what you see in a clear cut with reserves strategy here is reinitiating the stand, as again with severe wind throw, to create that habitat. You're favoring non-ash species for natural regeneration. You're increasing or introducing non-ash replacement species via artificial regeneration. So the configuration of retention and removal can vary considerably. It can be in strips or patches, or in some cases diameter limit cutting are feasible if care is taken, again, to avoid those large gaps. More common that we're seeing in the last few years is seed tree approaches. And here you're looking at a 1/2 acre to 1 acre gap sizes where the non-ash trees are left for seed and are not harvested. These are typically logger select, where the logger decides where they're being left. In this case, you have spruce being left in the background here, scattered to provide seed. And there are some examples of advanced regeneration here of spruce in the foreground. But you know, it's a difficult. This is again the very wet community, and you do see some cattails and some challenges. So these trees are really growing on unique microsites on the hummock portions of the soil. Here was an example too where we did some planting, spot planting of yellow birch and spruce, and they appear to be doing well at this time. Strip shelter wood, this is emulating that selective wind throw approach. So gap sizes are slightly smaller, a 1/4 acre to 1/2 acre in size. Here the idea is to sort of partition the stand. Strips can vary depending on management objectives and the tree species of interest for regeneration. And the idea here also, though, is in large ash stands, we want to avoid having equipment traffic in these wetland interiors. So we're really trying to work perpendicular to the slope, harvesting along the areas that transition to mesic, so that if we're cutting aspen, balsam, or red maple and other species, that might be able to ingress along those edges and provide some diversity. So just an example of what that looks like on the ground. You know, again, the strip width can vary considerably depending on the management objective. And as the equipment does move through the strip to cut, the logger can reach in and remove trees on either side of the strip, and which would make more of a uniform shelter wood approach. Group selection is another opportunity, and emulating that natural disturbance regime. It's a little more trickier. There's a little more complexity to designing a prescription like this, but you typically are going to have clearer partial small gap removals to reduce the ash and maintain that hydrologic function and provide that right balance between growth and light for the trees of interest. Opportunities here could be to bundle black ash with adjacent upland mesic hardwood stands to make it more attractive for operators that are bidding on forestry timber sales. So you can see here the forester has designed these small gaps where the interior tree is designated and a distance is specified around that point center of approximately 100 feet. but he's also bundled it with some slightly larger clear-cut openings of aspen. So it makes it more of an attractive sale and helps diversify that forest after harvest. And then thinning is typically a small gap strategy. On the highest quality stands, we don't have a lot of this in on state lands, but it does happen from time to time. It's more of a selective mark to remove a mix of these trees, black ash trees, from the crown classes. And the goal is to avoid damage to advanced non-ash regeneration where feasible. These thin stands also may be suitable for ash understory or enrichment planting. In that case, we're really calling it more of a regeneration harvest rather than a true thinning, which is more of a focus on the crop tree, as you can see here with this sawlog tree. So the nomenclature on how we think about ash management needs to be thought through for foresters thinking about regeneration strategies. So just looking at issues more broadly, it can get very challenging, I think, to think about ash management, given that many of these stands are remote. They all require frozen ground access. We've had some challenging winters in terms of being able to freeze down ash stands for management. The volume often is not that great in terms of removals per acre. You're typically going to be ranging from 6 to 12 cords per acre. Stumpage value is low. As I mentioned, markets can be up and down. They're not really strong right now. You have that concern for swamping and disrupting the hydrology. And of course, replacement species can be difficult to establish naturally or artificially. So all of these factors together, make it very challenging for us to manage black ash sustainably, and also being able to assess regeneration at a landscape level. But it is important to realize that we have a mission to try to sustain these forests, to renew damaged acres and maintain these ecosystem benefits ahead of EAB. So really at this point, we think about a paradigm shift in the way we think about ash management and looking at more of an adaptive approach, which is in the context of prescription. So assessing what the issue is, how to regenerate sites, designing, implementing, monitoring, evaluating, and making adjustments to prescriptions. So the more we can share that information and learn from each other on what stands are doing well and what stands have not done so well is the context that we want to be giving our guidance out to field staff. So when we think about strategies, we can kind of think about it on this pendulum between resistance, resilience, and transition. We really want to support and encourage all those type of strategies. So resistance is really thinking about forestalling undesired effects of change in the short term. So activities might include regenerating without deliberate reforestation after harvest in terms of planting or seeding or live staking. It's sort of just maybe taking defensive actions to limit invasives. Resilience, on the other hand, is the opportunity for stands to respond to change. So here we're thinking about diversifying species composition, planting, seeding, or stand improvement using brush saw or even spot ground herbicide to control undesirable vegetation. It's a much more proactive, hands-on approach. And the goal here is to provide the widest variety of habitats, trees, and native plants. The transition is that intentional management activity to allow stands to adapt and respond, particularly in the context of climate change. So here it's creating new habitat and new species combinations where you might be bringing tree species from southern portions of the state from different slightly warmer seed zones ahead of EAB. So again, that's the context moving forward, is this adaptive framework and strategy for thinking about how we manage, which then helps us think about how do we look at our management goals more broadly under this living with EAB. So the landscape perspective is really not to focus on the insect. It's looking at the ecosystem and the hydrology. The overarching goal is to keep forested sites forested, trying to minimize impacts to habitat and biodiversity where we can. The stand perspective is that adaptive approach. So matching the silvicultural system with natural disturbance regime, trying to capture timber value and volume sustainably, and then increase tree species diversity. So focus on the best quality ash stats where we can. So opportunities recently, this map here shows, again, these green points here of recent intentional reforestation projects. Some of these date back to the middle part of this decade, and even one here that dates back to 1999. But most interest is this one that's west of Duluth. This is where the forester intentionally planted up to 12 replacement species on a project that we're partnering with the University of Minnesota, Department of Forest Resources on a case study. So the first year, so the suite of species that were planted here are shown here, highlighted in yellow, and our first year regeneration indicates overall survival of the planted stock around 50%. Swamp white oak was at 100%, bur oak was at 100%, and paper birch had high survival, following by balsam fir and silver maple and cottonwood. And of course, natural regeneration of ash was well abundant and well distributed. We also received funding as part of a U.S. Forest Service Great Lakes Restoration Initiative grant. That's partnering with the American Bird Conservancy, with Carleton County and Fond du Lac. We're all working in this part of the state. We're pretty excited about that. That's going to focus on the high priority watersheds in the Great Lakes, which is highlighted here in blue with this Western Lake Superior watershed, which of course we know EAB is close by. So the intent here is to treat around 100 acres on 5 to 10 different sites, planting approximately 4 to 1,000 trees per acre in this suite of species. And that work will be set to kick off next spring. So looking to just to wrap up here, the importance of monitoring and tracking prescriptions, natural regeneration is going to be very important. We'll want to be intentional about looking at regeneration assessment and value evaluation on our 3 to 5 year old stands where we're doing planting on, and then developing more case studies. There's a number of great resources available for folks out there, including this extension guideline through the University of Minnesota that's targeted at woodland owners managing ash woodlands. There's some field guides on climate change for northern Minnesota forests, and we're set to release our ash management guidelines at the end of the year here or early next year, which will provide much more robust guidelines for managing ash. Wisconsin DNR has some great resources as well, and also available research papers through the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. The Great Lakes Silviculture Library hosts a lot of great information on prescriptions across a variety of cover types, but there are a few here on ash forests as well. And then the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science has some great tools on their website as well. So I'd like to acknowledge the utilization and marketing forest health and silviculture teams. Special thanks to Kristen Bergstrand, Val Cervenka, Brian Schwingle, and Mike Reinekainen. I want to recognize Brian Palick and the work of the U.S. Forest Service, and also the folks involved with the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, who through the American Bird Conservancy, Carleton County, Fond du Lac, are helping us with that project. So with that, Robin, I think we can open it up for questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Paul and Brian and Val. We've gotten lots of good information from this presentation. I have a couple of questions, and these occurred during Brian's part of the presentation. No, the first question is, why is Manchurian ash resistant?
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. So just my understanding, it comes from the region where EAB comes from as well, so they co-evolve together, and I don't know if they're truly resistant or they're tolerant, but that was the thought with the people that suggested we plant that it may be tolerant or resistant and be a potential cultural replacement for black ash.
All right. The second question is, what was the planting spacing / pattern in the ash replacement study? Was deer herbivory a problem?
So answering that second question first, yes, it is a problem, continues to be. We didn't do anything to discourage it, thinking that actually perhaps in that wetland setting there wouldn't be as intense pressure, but there is. And so there is, and we note that when we're measuring seedlings, if they look browsed. The spacing, so what I'll say is this wasn't planted in a way that was meant to be a fully stocked stand. These were planted as more phytometers. So I can't tell you the exact spacing, but it was pretty low density because we weren't looking to fully utilize the growing space for regeneration, rather just get enough individuals planted and established to measure.
All right. I have another question here. Is Minnesota capable of planting enough alternative trees to keep most of your black ash forests forested? I don't know who wants to take that one, but
I can answer or try to answer that question. I think the answer is given the amount of acres in Minnesota, 1 million acres, 1 billion trees, it's really not realistic to think that artificial regeneration is going to be a dominant strategy for reforestation. So we really need to rely on natural regeneration as best we can of those non-ash species that are predicted to do well in a warmer and wetter, cold climate. But we want to be as proactive as we can where it makes sense in targeting those communities and finding species that are going to be well adapted, like swamp white oak, bur oak, hackberry, and silver maple, and learn from that. I think there's 2 other strategies that haven't been tried in great detail. That's live staking of balsam poplar. That's a opportunity for making those cuttings and directly planting them into the ground. And then even aerial seeding conifers hasn't been tried to any extent. Those are 2 strategies that we'd like to monitor, which could be implemented in a way that would cover more acres than you would see with planting.
I'll just add to that, Paul. The Chippewa National Forest is actually pretty actively using the live staking. I've always thought of that as whips of balsam poplar that are just dipped in hormones and planted in the ground or stuck into the ground. And so it is easier and faster, and that's the approach that they've been taking. And I think it's a fair amount of acreage that's being done.
okay. We have another question here. It says, does larch grow in this habitat? It didn't seem to be addressed in any of your graphs.
So we did plant it. This is Brian Pollock. We did plant it, and has pretty low survival in the settings we put it in, but where it has survived, it's grown like gangbusters. So our recent remeasurement, it's really taken off. So it's a potential, but given that this is kind of a big scale research project for us, we're also looking at the long-term implications of climate change, and larger tamarack has projections for reduced habitat suitability by the end of the century. So it may not be a long-term solution.
And this is Val. I just want to add to that, Brian, that our tamarack is being killed by eastern larch beetle in an outbreak since 2001. And about 48% of the tamarack resources has been affected to some degree or other, either dying or dead. So just saying.
All right. I am not seeing other questions or comments at this point, but again, I will be sending out an email to all of our participants today with the contact information of our presenters today, as well as the survey. So if you have other questions that you think about after the meeting is over, feel free to email them with those questions. And again, tell your coworkers or friends about this webinar. It will be posted on the emeraldashborer.info website on the EAB University page. Again, I wanted to thank all three of you. This has been great information, very well presented, and is very helpful for what we've been trying to strive to do here at EAB University and get the word out on what's been going on with both EAB and ASH. So thanks again. I want to thank everybody who participated. I'm going to close the meeting and have everyone have a good day.